You ever witness a moment so tiny, yet so strong it alters everything? Not a long speech, not some over-the-top melodramatic action, just an easy, near, boring moment, but one that alters the whole trajectory of a life. That's precisely what occurred to Mrs. Evelyn Carter. Evelyn had been a teacher in an elementary school in a small Atlanta suburb for over 3 decades. She'd begun when she was hardly 20, too, hair swept back into a worried bun in a room full of big-eyed first graders. As the years went by, her hair grayed in streaks. The bun gave way to a more relaxed style, but the passion she had for teaching never wavered. She'd instructed under just about anything. Tornado warnings that caused students to cower in the hallways, snow days that arrived unexpectedly in Georgia, budget reductions that resulted in her sometimes having to purchase her own materials. She'd even experienced those sad mornings when a child didn't come to school with breakfast, sporting shoes that were too small, or coats that were insufficient. And each time, she managed to find a way to provide what her students needed, be it a sandwich from her own lunchbox, a spare set of mittens from the lost and found bin, or simply a smile that communicated, "I see you, you matter." She felt she could no longer be surprised, but that morning, she was proven wrong. It was autumn morning, the type when the air was crisp but the sun retained a gentle warmth outside her window. The trees only began to suggest their fall hues, an occasional yellow leaf drifting to the ground. Among her classroom, the children's chatter merged into that typical morning harmony. The whir of conversation, the squeak of sneakers against the tile, the jingle of pencils in a cup. Evelyn walked from desk to desk, verifying homework folders, responding to questions, proffering soft reminders to a couple of kids who hadn't yet stowed their backpacks. It was the routine, the comfortable, the predictable, and then she saw him. In the back of the classroom, at a desk toward the window, was a boy she didn't know. He wasn't staring at the other children. He wasn't playing with his materials. He wasn't even scanning the room like new students tended to do, being impressed by everything. Rather, his small body was tensed, his back arched slightly forward, his shoulders hunched in like he was attempting to shrink himself. His hands were folded on his desk, not in that precise, patient manner some children possess, but in a manner that seemed guarded, protective. As if he just sat stock still, nothing terrible would occur. And his eyes, wide, dark brown eyes, were staring down at the desk's surface, not merely viewing it, but sort of hiding behind it. He didn't say anything. He didn't smile. He didn't squirm. He just sat there, as still as a rock in a stream. Evelyn had worked with enough kids to recognize when she was staring at plain shyness. She'd seen the kind of newbie jitters that cause a kid to look away when you catch their eyes or knot their hands in their lap. But this was something else. This is the sort of quiet that happens when a child knows that getting attention directed to them might result in hurt. The sort of silence that doesn't arise from not knowing what to say, but from feeling unsafe enough to say it. She had no idea about his history yet. She had no idea why he was there, or where he had been, or what demons might have accompanied him. But she could feel it, down in her bones. This was a kid who was carrying something much too heavy for a kid his age, and that was all it took for her to move. Without hesitation, without seeking permission or concern for how it would appear, she walked across the room, her feet patting softly on the tile. She didn't walk up from behind him. She wouldn't risk startling a child who appeared to be on edge. She went around to the side of his desk and knelt down to his level. For a moment, she just stayed there, her presence quiet but steady. Then she spoke, her voice gentle, steady, low enough so no one else would hear. "It's all right, sweetheart," she said. "You're safe here." And then, without hesitating, she opened her arms and wrapped them around him in the gentlest hug. It wasn't a hasty, embarrassed slap on the back. It wasn't the hug side, hugs that adults exchange when they don't want to show too much love. It was warm, slow, and steady. The kind of hug that tells you, "I'm not in a hurry. Take your time." She felt the slightest stirring of his shoulders, as if he'd inhaled a breath that he'd been holding for so long. But he didn't move into her. He didn't wrap his arms around her. And that was all right. She didn't require him to. No words, no terms, only heat and quiet. She lingered for a second before rising and continuing on her way, providing distance but also making it clear she'd seen him, really seen him. What Evelyn didn't know, not at that moment, not at all, was that she had ignited a spark, a tiny one, nearly imperceptible, but one that would smolder in ways beyond her wildest imagination. Because that hug, so mundane to her, was the first safe touch this boy had experienced in a long, long time. And that single act would initiate a chain reaction involving secrets, suspicion, and a revelation that would shake the whole community. From that point on, Evelyn Carter took it as her own. silent mission to find young Daniel. It wasn't something she told anyone, not the principal, not her other teachers, not even her husband when she arrived home in the evenings. It was just something she bore in her heart, like a secret only she and God required knowledge of. Evelyn had worked with children who were having a tough time for all kinds of reasons: academic difficulties, home issues, medical issues, or simply the clumsiness of adolescence. But she couldn't recall when she'd felt as drawn to assist a child as she felt now about this one. There was something in Daniel's quietness, in the gravitas of his eyes, a sense that more weight belonged there than any 8-year-old should be bearing, which indicated that this boy needed someone who wouldn't give up on him. So she began small. On the second morning after he arrived, she slid a folded note into his desk before the day began. She had drawn a simple smiley face and written, "I'm glad you're here." She didn't watch him read it. She knew better than to hover, but later that day, when she walked by, she noticed it tucked carefully inside his pencil case. That small detail made her smile. Each day, she discovered a new quiet means of making him aware that he was noticed. Sometimes it was allowing him to assist with watering the tall green plant near the window of her classroom, observing how he measured out the water with slow, intentional exactness. Sometimes it was sitting with him during recess, when the other children took off to play tag or kickball. She did not interrogate him with queries or seek to illuminate the quiet moments with incessant talk. Rather, she merely sat, occupying space, indicating to him that his presence was sufficient. Early on, Daniel's reactions were nearly imperceptible. A side glance towards her when she talked, the slightest upturn of his lips when she gave him a new sheet of drawing paper, a nod when she asked him if he'd like to assist with a small classroom activity. Most teachers might have missed those little changes, but Evelyn noticed them all. She was a believer in small victories. She knew trust wasn't built in a day, sometimes not even in a year. Then, one late afternoon in September, when the sunlight outside began to turn golden and slant low through the tall windows of the classroom, Daniel approached her desk. He didn't utter a word. He didn't even glance at her. He just held out a crumpled sheet of paper, put it down gently on the edge of her desk, and turned to leave. Curious, Evelyn smoothed out the paper. The handwriting was uneven and shaky. The letters formed with effort. It read, "Thank you for caring." That was it. 4 words. But the 4 words struck her more forcefully than any compliment she had ever heard during her years in business. Her throat constricted, her eyes welled up. She wrapped her hand around the paper for an instant, holding it close, as though that would make the sensation last longer. Then she gently pushed it into her pocket, a keepsake she knew she'd carry for the rest of her life. That evening, after washing the evening meal dishes, she pulled the note from its hiding place and read it for the umpteenth time under the warm glow of her kitchen lamp. She remembered all the times through the years when she'd watched teachers give up on a quiet child, believing that their silence meant they weren't trying or didn't care. But Daniel's note was evidence that silence was not absence. Silence was waiting, waiting for the person who could find them. The following morning, she entered the classroom with the stillness of hope, but before the day had even started, something occurred that caused her to hesitate. She sat at her desk, sorting through the pile of spelling tests from yesterday, when she heard the rumble of a car engine outside. Not out of the ordinary, but this one didn't have the same familiar whine of minivans and compact sedans in the morning drop offline. It was lower, softer, more like a soft growl. She looked out the window and noticed a black sedan pulling up to the curb. It sparkled in the morning sun, the type of glow that is the result of both money spent and meticulous attention. The car's tinted windows made it so one couldn't tell anything inside. Her first thought was that it must be someone lost. Nobody in their little town drove a car like that. But then the back door opened, and a man in a perfectly tailored black suit stepped out. He moved with that precise, measured efficiency of someone used to being invisible yet essential, a driver. He circled the car and opened the rear door. Out stepped a woman. She was tall, confident, and dressed head to toe in a neatly tailored sophistication that appeared almost jarring against the weathered brick of the school building. Her dark hair was perfectly styled, her heels sharply clicking down the pavement, and her eyes concealed behind large, dark sunglasses. She bore no purse, no briefcase, only herself, as if she was. Sufficient introduction. There was a quality about her, something that reminded Evelyn of the women she saw occasionally in the city on her occasional weekend outings. Women who strode around the world as if it would accommodate them. The woman didn't stop to look around. She didn't nod at the playground or pass a greeting to anyone in the parking lot. She simply went directly towards the front doors of the school with a firm pace, the clicking of her heels sounding softly even from where Evelyn was. In seconds, she was standing outside the classroom door. The classroom grew nearly. Silent kids are masters at picking up on when something is out of the ordinary. All the tiny eyes watched the stranger as she entered. She came to a halt just shy of Evelyn's desk. "Mrs. Carter," she said, her tone even, silky, and with an undertone of authority that caused the question to sound almost like a declaration. "Yes," Evelyn answered, her voice courteous but inquiring. "Hello, I'm Margaret Lawson. I'm Daniel's mother." Evelyn smiled, maintaining her warm expression. "It's lovely to meet you. Daniel's been getting settled in." Margaret interrupted her, not brusquely, but with the same accuracy she'd entered with. "I hear you hugged my son." Evelyn blinked. She couldn't decipher the tone. Disapproval, curiosity, gratitude. It was impossible to say. "Yes, ma'am," she replied at last. He looked like he could use it. The woman's immaculate mask slipped for an instant. Her lips pursed, her chin fell slightly, and Evelyn saw a flash of something on her face, surprise and sadness. "Daniel won't let anyone touch him," Margaret whispered. Then, as if she'd said more than she meant to, she stiffened her shoulders and continued, not since she caught herself. "Thank you." And with that, she turned, her heels clicking sharply on the linoleum as she left, the sound dwindling until the door closed behind her. Evelyn remained there, still clutching the pile of spelling tests, having no idea what had just occurred. The entire dialogue had occurred in less than 2 minutes, and yet it created a ripple in the atmosphere, an awareness that there was more to this tale than she was familiar with. "Mrs. Carter." The woman's voice was low, steady, and even the kind of voice she used to having others hear her out. Evelyn glanced up at the doorway to find the woman standing there, tall and immaculately turned out. Her complexion was the warm brown of chestnut, unlined and youthful. Her dark hair pulled back into a streamlined chignon from which not one strand ventured. The dark sunglasses covered most of her eyes, but her posture alone told Evelyn that this was someone who moved through life with purpose. "Yes," Evelyn said cautiously. "I'm Margaret Lawson," the woman continued. "I'm Daniel's mother." She spoke like she was presenting herself at a board of directors meeting, direct, curt, with no hint of small talk. Evelyn stood up from her seat, offering her hand, but Margaret didn't reciprocate. Instead, her eyes, concealed behind dark glasses, swept across the room. It seemed like she was evaluating it, taking measurements of the space, and noting every detail before finally returning her gaze to Evelyn. Evelyn had taught all types of parents throughout her 30 years of classroom experience. Anxious ones, sorry ones, dominating ones. But this woman, she exuded an energy that was neither warm nor cold. It was heavier, a stillness that presented itself as quiet authority and made you naturally stiffen your back. Margaret entered, the sharp snap of her heels slicing through the silence of the vacant room. Her perfume, subtle, costly, wafted in its wake. Evelyn could catch a glimpse of herself in the shiny surface of those sunglasses as Margaret came to a halt just a few feet from her. "I hear you hugged my son," Margaret said. It was not exactly a question. It was not exactly an accusation. It was somewhere in between, something requiring strategic handling. Evelyn's hands clenched around the rim of her desk before she replied, "Yes, ma'am, I did." He looked like he needed it. The silence that ensued was long enough for Evelyn to hear the soft hum of the fluorescent lights above. Margaret's lips parted and then closed once more, and in the split second, the perfect calm on her face wavered. It was slight, so slight most folks wouldn't have seen it, but Evelyn did. The slightest tremor in her jaw, the near imperceptible tightening around her mouth. "Daniel doesn't allow anyone to touch him," Margaret finally replied, her tone softer now. "Not since." She cut herself off. As if by magic, the wall had returned. Her shoulders jerked up a fraction of an inch, and she tucked the cuff of her jacket into place, ironing out the non-existent crease as if it were an anchor keeping her together. "Not since," Evelyn gently encouraged. Margaret's chin jutted up, her voice chilly. "It doesn't matter now." She paused and then spoke more softly. "Thank you for whatever you did." Her words were heartfelt enough, but there was something going on underneath, something unsaid, something Evelyn couldn't quite put her finger on. By the time Evelyn could speak, Margaret had spun on her heel. Her going was as clinical as her arrival, crisp, unhurried, definitive. The tapping of her heels grew fainter down the corridor until the only thing remaining was the lingering sweet scent of her perfume in the air. Evelyn lingered there for a moment, the silence in the room feeling unnatural. She had hugged hundreds of children throughout her career, sometimes for reassurance, sometimes for celebration, sometimes just for no reason at all, because children need hugs. But never before had a parent responded like that. Why had Margaret Lawson, who oozed money, influence, and dominance, looked so disturbed? Why would a nice soft hug be so important that it was worth driving to school during the morning to talk about, face to face? Evelyn returned to her seat slowly, her thoughts whirling. She played over the encounter in her mind, dwelling on the break in Margaret's sentence. Not since. Not since what? Her gaze wandered to the rear of the room, to the small table where Daniel had sat before. Even unoccupied, it seemed to possess a still dignity, the way some locations do after something significant has occurred within them. She thought of the boy's hunched shoulders, his guarded eyes, of the way he kept his hands close to his body, as if bracing against the world, of the note he'd given her, "Thank you for caring." Somewhere along the lines of those 4 words and his mother's carefully guarded face, Evelyn felt a story. A story hidden deep, bound tight, and locked behind a door that someone, perhaps everybody, was too frightened to open. And although she didn't yet realize it, that door would swing wide in the weeks ahead. But for the moment, all she could do was guess. The rest of that day, she kept looking over at the classroom door, expecting Margaret to come back. But she did not. The next morning, Daniel entered normally as usual, sneaking into his seat with his eyes set on his desk. Only now, Evelyn couldn't help but see him with the shadow of his mother's response. It caused her to catch things she hadn't before. How Daniel winced at loud noises. How his eyes moved to the door whenever there were footsteps down the hall. How he seemed to tense himself before talking, as if words were an expenditure. At the end of the week, Evelyn did know one thing for sure. Whatever Margaret Lawson had not told her that morning was the very thing she would need to know if she was to assist Daniel. And something inside her sensed that this was no run of the mill parent-teacher situation. In the course of the following weeks, Evelyn could see something truly astounding unfold. Not all at the same time, but in subtle, almost invisibly small waves. Initially, it was a brief flash of change in Daniel's eyes. They were no longer as obscured as they had been. When she saw him in the mornings, he no longer had his eyes fixed on the floor. Then he began to put his hand up in class, tentatively at first, as if he feared that the world would laugh at him for being bold enough to be noticed. One Tuesday, as she questioned the life cycle of plants, Daniel's small hand shot up. It was just above the desk, but it was up. Evelyn smiled, nodded to him, and he replied in a gentle whisper, "Seed, sprout, leaves." The rest of the class hardly registered, but to Evelyn, it seemed like the moment a winter river first thaws under the spring. Sun still, but strong enough to reshape the landscape. Days went by. His whispers turned into sentences. His steps turned more confident. One day, she even caught him grinning when another boy made a goofy joke about a dinosaur who could not find his shoes. The grin did not last, but Evelyn had seen it. It was like glimpsing sunlight peeking through dark clouds. But with the progress, something also caught Evelyn's attention. Each Friday afternoon, just as the final bell rang, Daniel would look at the classroom door again and again. His eyes didn't simply look, they searched, as if he was expecting someone. One Friday, that someone walked in. The door knocked as the students were gathering their bags. The principal's voice over the intercom summoned Evelyn to his office. No reason was given, but his tone had the seriousness of something official. Evelyn found the office abnormally still, the blinds half drawn to keep out the sunlight late in the afternoon. Margaret Lawson was seated immaculately in a charcoal business suit. Standing next to her was a gray-suited man of immense presence, his suit perfectly cut and his eyes as sharp as Daniel's. Evelyn estimated he was in his 50s, with perfectly groomed silver hair and the same piercing eyes Daniel possessed. The principal sat behind his desk, but even he was more observer than host. Margaret indicated the chair across from her. "Mrs. Carter, thank you for visiting. I know it's the end of the day." Evelyn sat, her hands neatly folded in her lap. "Of course. Is this concerning Daniel?" Margaret shared a look with the man sitting next to her, then leaned forward a bit. "Yes, but not in the manner you may believe." Her voice was measured, deliberate, as if she'd already weighed every word before she'd spoken them. "My family," she said, "owns Lawson Industries." Evelyn blinked. The name could not be avoided. Lawson Industries was the gem of the state's economy, a vast network of factories, tech centers, and corporate headquarters. Their logo was ubiquitous. Billboards, scholarships, city park plaques. Margaret went on, "Our company is worth billions. People tend to treat us differently because of that." Evelyn had no idea where this was headed, so she remained silent. Margaret drew a tiny breath, her demeanor wavering just ever so slightly. "Daniel hasn't spoken to anyone outside our house in almost a year. Not tutors, not therapists, not even family members." Then he met you. She stopped, her eyes welling up, not with the staggy, self-conscious tears of an actress playing a scene, but with the unadorned, soft tears of a mother who has been censoring herself for too long. The other night, she went on, he said to me, "Mrs. Carter makes me feel safe." That's the first whole sentence he's spoken in months. Evelyn's throat constricted. She'd been teaching long enough to recognize when a child's silence was due to shyness, and when it was due to something else altogether. She also knew that she had no special training in trauma counseling. She hadn't worked from a checklist or read a guidebook. She'd simply done the one thing that came easily. She'd cared. The man beside Margaret finally spoke. His voice was deep and steady, with the quiet authority of someone who rarely needed to raise it. "I'm Richard Lawson, Daniel's father." Evelyn nodded politely. Richard continued, "We've had every expert money can buy. Child psychologists, speech therapists, behavioral specialists. They've all tried to help. Nothing worked. Until you." Evelyn's cheeks grew warm. "I didn't do anything out of the ordinary. I just treated him as though he was important." Margaret's mouth curved into a small, wistful smile. "That's more uncommon than you know, Mrs. Carter." But before Evelyn could pose the question searing her mind, why did he ever stop talking to begin with? Margaret shifted uncomfortably in her seat, the steel creeping back into her posture. "Daniel trusts you. That's why we needed to speak with you face to face. There are things you need to hear, but they're not allowed to leave this room." The headmaster cleared his throat, and Stample cleared his throat. It's Stample hugs Stample. "The Lawsons have asked for complete discretion, Mrs. Carter. This is a delicate situation." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. She got the feeling that whatever was about to happen wasn't just about a boy getting his voice back. This was bigger, heavier, the kind of truth that didn't just account for the past. It had the potential to alter the future. Margaret clasped her hands together, her voice dropping. "Whatever went on with Daniel last year is complicated, hurtful, and that's why we guard him so aggressively." She stared hard at Evelyn. "And if you're willing, Nas, you could be the only person who can help us guard him now." Evelyn sat very quietly, the whir of the office clock in the background. She wasn't quite sure what she was committing herself to, but one thing she did know, Daniel's healing had only just started, and somehow she'd been set directly at its heart. The silence in the principal's office was oppressive, as though the air itself was holding its breath. Evelyn's eyes flicked back and forth between Margaret Lawson, the imposing figure of money and power, and the principal, who sat rigidly behind his desk like a man not knowing whether he should say something or just get out of the way. Margaret's pressed fingers pushed into her shiny black handbag and withdrew an envelope. She laid it carefully on the principal's desk with calculating calm. Evelyn saw the brief flash of a pen-scrawled digit on the other side of the paper, a digit so big that anyone's heart would skip a beat. But Evelyn hardly glanced at it. She didn't want to count the zeros. She was focused on Margaret's face, the slight quiver at the edge of her lips, the uncommon vulnerability lurking behind eyes that had likely glared down boardrooms full of men unblinking. Margaret's voice shattered the silence. "I've created an empire, Mrs. Carter. I've made deals worth more than some towns. I've sat across from individuals who would sell their own conscience for a fraction of what I've paid them. But all of that," she waved her hand vaguely toward the window, as if pointing to the world outside, "means nothing when I could not give my own son what you gave him in one hug." The headmaster leaned forward in his chair, visibly stirred but not certain if he was even allowed to speak. Margaret breathed, her voice gentling in a manner Evelyn had never heard before. "I'm asking you, will you come work for us privately as Daniel's full-time teacher?" The words held in the air like the ringing of a far-off bell. Evelyn's head was reeling. She'd taught in public schools for close to 15 years. She was familiar with the creak of these antique floors in the classrooms, the fragrance of sharp pencils and warm erasers, the cadence of bell times and morning announcements. She adored her kids, all 23 of them this year, each of them with their own peculiarities and difficulties. It would mean leaving behind them. Her eyes flicked at Daniel. He hadn't been in the office when she'd entered, but now, as if he'd been waiting patiently for his cue in silence, the door creaked open and he moved in. He stood smaller in this large, stiff room, his small body engulfed by the oversized sleeves of his blue sweater. But his eyes, those deep, observant eyes, didn't duck behind the same invisible wall she'd noticed the first time they met. He came directly to her. Without hesitation, he took her hand in his small fingers wrapped around hers, warm and sure. And then, in a voice so gentle Evelyn nearly believed she'd imagined it, he spoke one word: please. It was not a request, it was a rope, lowering her into a truth she could not avoid. Evelyn swallowed. She remembered that first day, the silent boy who ate by himself at recess, who winced when the world intruded too close. She remembered the gradual unfreezing, the scribbled note with thank you for caring across it, the way he brightened slightly, but unmistakably, when she allowed him to assist with watering the plants. And now here he was, standing before her, inquiring not in great speeches, but in a single word and the firm hold of a child who had made up his mind that she was safe. She knelt so that their eyes were on the same level. The office, the principal, Margaret Lawson's watchful eye, all of it faded at the edges. "Are you sure?" Evelyn asked softly. Daniel nodded, once, and in that moment she realized this was not a job offer. It was a turning point for him, for her, perhaps for both their lives. She thought about what it would mean. Leaving the classroom would be hard. Her students would miss her, and she would miss them. But Daniel wasn't just another student. He was a boy standing at the fragile edge of trust, reaching for her with the hope that she might not let go. She smiled faintly, tears pressing against her eyes. "Okay," she whispered back. "I'll come." Daniel's lips twitched into something close to a smile, the rare, precious kind she'd learned to treasure. Margaret, for the first time, allowed her own composure to crack. She exhaled as if she'd been holding her breath for months. "You have no idea what this means," she said softly. "You've given my son back his voice." Evelyn didn't realize that, but she was aware she could offer him her presence, her patience, and her heart. When she stood, Daniel refused to release her hand. Not when Margaret started discussing the details, not when the principal attempted to speak up about contracts, not even when they stepped out into the sunlight of the late afternoon. He just held on, as if he was afraid she would disappear if he relaxed his hold. That evening, Evelyn sat at her kitchen table, looking at the letter of resignation she had just penned. Her house was still, the whir of the refrigerator providing the only sound. She considered the years spent working late into the night to grade papers, the mornings of welcoming sleepy children with a smile, the day after day of coffee cups growing cold beside piles of lesson plans. She wasn't closing a chapter. She was opening up a completely new book, one in which she would be accountable for teaching not only a child, but for reconstructing the fragments of him that life had shattered. And secretly, she knew her own life would change in ways she never could have imagined.